Samuel wearily placed his suitcase on the table and began to unbutton his jacket. He was relieved that the long, cold and dreary December day was finally over. The doctor was already imagining how he would go home and get under a hot shower for about 20 minutes and then drink some hot tea with ginger and lemon for a long and leisurely time. "Oh, are you back already?" Carla greeted him in a syrupy voice. Over her blue medical uniform, she had thrown a thick, long shawl, a necessity given the poor heating in the small district hospital. The doctor was wary. Carla was easy to work with, not only because she was local and knew all the doctors and patients well, but also because the nurse always had everything written down properly. And now, by the guilty expression and flattering tone of her voice, it was clear that Samuel was expecting not very pleasant news. "What else is on our plate today, Carla?" he asked, in as stern a voice as he could muster. But his stern voice didn't fool the nurse. After 5 years of working together, Carla knew Samuel only feigned strict. He was genuinely kind and composed. "We have another call," she said softly, pushing a report towards him. Samuel's dark eyes lifted, nearly touching his curly hair. "No," Samuel responded firmly. "My shift ended 2 hours ago." "Dr. Creedy, please," Carla pleaded. "It's an elderly woman living alone on the outskirts of the village. Coincidentally, it's near your summer cottage. You could stop by there on your way home." "I have so much to do at home in December," Samuel replied, his voice heavy with sarcasm. However, his tone had softened, and Carla sensed she was winning. "You know, in a snowstorm like this, no ambulance can navigate our roads," she added, delivering her final argument. "Yes, I know," Samuel sighed, rubbing his eyes. "Tell me what's happened to this elderly woman of yours." Seizing the opportunity before Samuel could change his mind, Carla quickly relayed the details. "Here, I wrote it down for you. Take the main street, turn right at the store, and go all the way to the end. It's the last house with the green gate." "Yes, my cottage isn't far." "Aha," the nurse replied cheerfully, then asked, "Should I wait for you?" The doctor shook his head. "Go home, Carla. Your workday is long over. I'll stay at my summer house after the patient and come here in the morning." They said goodbye and Samuel went to the car. He hoped the old car would start despite the frost. The car grumbled, coughed, but started. The snowstorm made driving challenging, especially with the few street lamps providing minimal light. As Samuel passed the store and turned right, he thought he saw a figure on the road. Upon closer look, it was a woman. She was swaying slightly and holding a large bundle to her chest, presumably a child. Samuel slowed down. "Hey," he called through the rolled-down window, "do you need a ride?" The woman looked frightened, but calmed when she saw Samuel. Approaching the car, Samuel noticed her nose and hands were white from the cold, protruding from the sleeves of a thin, out-of-season coat. "Do you need help?" he asked. The woman looked at him with large black eyes and suddenly nodded. Samuel shuddered. Why had he stopped in the first place? She could have been a local on her way home. Now that he knew she was in trouble, he couldn't just drive away. He fumbled in his jacket pocket, pulled out a set of keys and detached one. "Walk around this house. There's a grove behind it. It's not big. You'll pass it in about 5 minutes. After it, there's a cottage settlement. You need the second house. It's decorated with wooden carvings and with a blue roof. Don't get mixed up. Here's the key. I'll finish my job soon and join you, okay?" The woman nodded. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she quickly wiped them away. She held a wrapped child with one hand while accepting the key with the other. She staggered slightly, but then walked confidently in the indicated direction. "Am I a fool?" Samuel mumbled to himself. He sighed and hurried to his patient. He spent half an hour with Mrs. Wells. The elderly woman was okay. "I knew it was the blizzard, the damned," sighed the patient. "Every time the weather changes, it starts." "It happens," replied the doctor. "Have you taken your pills the last few days?" The elderly woman sighed guiltily. "I sometimes forget." "I see. I've written everything down for you. I've left a big note on the refrigerator. You can't miss it." "Thank you, Dr. Macready." The elderly lady thanked him. "May God bless you with good health, a good wife, and many children." The doctor wrinkled his nose, but didn't comment on the wish. "Your blood pressure is normal now, and your pulse is good, but if anything happens, call me." "Thank you," Mrs. Wells said to the doctor. "I'll go to bed now, and in the morning I'll be well." They said goodbye. Samuel stopped at the store on his way to the cottage. The snowstorm was getting worse, and visibility was almost zero. "I'll need to start the fireplace immediately," Samuel thought as he approached the house. He saw the light on in the windows. He looked inside and saw his new acquaintance near the bookcase. She seemed to hide a bundle in the shelves. Interesting, the man thought, and headed to the door, stomping loudly and slowly opening it. The first thing he felt in the house was warmth. His new acquaintance had managed to light the fireplace. She had also put on the kettle. "This is very convenient," said Samuel, putting a bag of groceries on the table. "I brought us some food, and I haven't been here for a while, so there's probably no food left." The woman didn't answer him. Now he could see her better. She looked more like a young girl, perhaps 18 or 20 years old. She had a youthful, thin face, dark skin, large black eyes, and matching hair, braided into a thick plait that reached her waist. But her face was mature and sad, suggesting recent grief. She hung her thin coat on a chair she'd placed next to the stove. Now she was wearing a simple long grey woolen skirt that reached mid-shin and a very light black blouse. She placed her boots near the stove, and Samuel thought that they too were not suitable for winter, like the coat. When he entered, the girl immediately rushed to the child, who was sitting in the chair, and picked him up. It seemed to be a girl. Blonde hair, dark eyes, like the girl's. She looked to be about 4 to 5 years old. "Have you warmed up?" the doctor asked. The girl nodded. Samuel sighed. Apparently, she was not very inclined to talk. "I'm going to make us dinner," he said. "I think it will take an hour. You can rest for now. Come with me, I will show you where." He led them to the far part of the house, where behind a thin partition stood a large bed. "You can lie down here for now," Samuel added, pulling out a thick down blanket. "The house hasn't warmed up completely yet, so you'll need the blanket." The girl carefully laid the little girl on the bed, took the blanket from the doctor's hands, lay down next to the child, covered them both, and looked at Samuel gratefully. "I'll call you when everything is ready," he said, and left, quietly closing the door. "Samuel, you do love to look for trouble," he thought to himself, putting a pot of water in a frying pan with oil on the stove. "Instead of living your own life, you deliberately find other sufferers to focus on them." Samuel boiled pasta, fried chicken, cut bread, sausage and cheese. He took milk and cookies out of the bag. In half an hour, everything was ready. He went to the room and opened the door, trying not to make noise. The girl immediately opened her eyes. "Sorry, I didn't mean to wake you," he said. "Are you coming to dinner?" The girl nodded and stood up, gently waking the child. The little girl stretched sleepily, but obediently got up and went. She seemed to be afraid to step away from her companion, even a step, and clung to her with her whole body. All three ate greedily and hastily. Samuel himself had only had time to drink tea early in the morning and was starving, and his new acquaintances, it seemed, had not eaten for a long time either. Finally, they all drank a second cup of tea and leaned back in their chairs. "Maybe we should talk now," Samuel politely suggested. "It seems it's time." The girl smiled weakly. "Okay," she said very quietly. "I can talk a little." She gestured to her throat. "Hurts?" Samuel asked. "I'm a doctor and can take a look." The girl shook her head. "All right, I won't insist. Can you tell me your name?" The guest thought for a few seconds and then answered, "Betty." "Nice to meet you, and I'm Samuel. And this beautiful little creature?" "Sophie." The little girl, hearing her name, suddenly clung to Betty and looked at her questioningly. She soothingly stroked her blonde curly hair. "Okay," said the man. "I understand that we won't talk today. Shall we go to bed?" "Yes," Betty said quietly. Samuel nodded and added, I will leave early for work tomorrow. It's a hospital in a neighbouring town, not too far from here. I'll try to return early. You'll stay here, right?" "Do you mind?" Betty asked, looking at him pleadingly. "No." The girl nodded. "Thank you." In the morning, Samuel nearly arrived late at work. The service car had frozen overnight and didn't want to start. Normally, Samuel took the bus to work from his city apartment. He rarely used his own car, which was parked in the garage. However, it might be more convenient to use it this weekend if, for example, Betty and her daughter needed a ride. "Why am I already considering them as if they will be with me for a long period? Perhaps I'll come home tonight and they'll be gone, as if everything is at the cottage," Samuel thought. At the clinic, Samuel saw that a small queue had formed in his office. He quickly changed and entered the office. "Hello, Dr. McCready." Carla greeted him cheerfully. "How did everything go yesterday?" "Fine, I left Mrs. Wells with a blood pressure of 120/80. "That's great. Can I invite the first patient?" "Yes, I'm ready." The blizzard was still raging. It was snowing so heavily that nothing could be seen out the window except for streams of snow. The frost was also increasing, so there were few patients. 4 people with minor frostbite, another who slipped on a frozen puddle and sprained his ankle, and a person with bronchitis. "Is that all?" Dr. McCready asked Carla. "Is that not enough for you?" the girl asked in surprise. "No, God forbid," the man exclaimed. "I'm just surprised." "Well, who wants to walk in such a storm? In normal weather, it's like entertainment to visit the clinic, sit in line, chat with friends, discuss their ailments and get a prescription. Today, only those who truly need it are coming." "Oh, Carla," the doctor sighed. "I've been working with you for so many years. I never cease to be amazed by your wisdom." The nurse smiled. Indeed, Samuel had been working here for about 7 years. A failure in family life brought him to this hospital in a backwater town. It all started in his first year of medical school, where he met his future wife. Vanessa was beautiful, intelligent, bright and funny. Samuel was the opposite of her. He was handsome too, but because of his natural modesty, he was almost not noticed. Besides, the guy devoted all his free time to studying. And Vanessa managed to be everywhere at once. She excelled in her studies, took extra biology and anatomy classes, and still found time to perform at university concerts. She was a talented singer and a gracious event leader. Vanessa was friendly towards everyone, including Samuel, but he didn't stand out more than the other guys to her. In their 3rd year, Samuel and Vanessa finally became friends. They were assigned to the same department for their summer internship, and eventually Vanessa noticed Samuel. On the last day of their internship, she proposed, "Let's go out." "Are you serious?" Samuel asked. "Do you not like me?" The young man blushed. "I've liked you for a long time," he confessed. Her face was radiant. Then it settled. 3 months later, they moved in together. It was the best time in Samuel's life. He and Vanessa were inseparable, at the university and at home. They studied together for tests, colloquiums, and exams. One day, Vanessa asked, "Where do you want to go for your internship?" "I'm not sure, probably therapy. How about you?" "I'm torn between endocrinology and neurology. I want to become the best specialist in my field. I dream of working in a private clinic, giving personal consultations and delivering lectures. What about you?" "Actually, I want to be a general practitioner." Vanessa smiled. "I've always seen you as an altruist. Just remember, real work isn't as sweet and colourful as it seems." After graduation, they got married and both entered internship programs. After much consideration, Vanessa chose endocrinology, while Samuel pursued general therapy, and he started working in a public clinic. Life seemed ideal for the young doctor. He loved his work and his wife. At work, he was respected and offered to stay with them after internship, and in a few years to get the position of head of the department. Samuel was ready to accept, but Vanessa opposed this decision. "It's just an ordinary public clinic," she objected. "So what? I can advance quickly in my career there." "Samuel," Vanessa approached him gently, wrapping her arms around his neck. "This isn't what we dreamed of. You're so smart and talented. You shouldn't spend your life in a shabby hospital. Is that what you've spent all these years studying for?" "Vanessa, we both want to help people. What does it matter where we do it?" "There's a big difference, Samuel. We can get a job at the Central Hospital with our characteristics and experience. Understand? It's important to me." They talked about this for a long time, and in the end, Samuel gave in to his wife. Working in the city's largest clinic was good, but a bit boring. There were many doctors there, and the young doctor was not given complex patients. Samuel felt that he was not developing there, but Vanessa was in her element there, and quickly and easily made friends with half the hospital. Samuel saw that Vanessa was like a fish in water, and he was ready to endure for her sake. So they worked for a while, until the day when Samuel accidentally went out to drink coffee. That day he had a lot of work, and also duty. With the number of patients and paperwork that needed to be completed, his head was spinning. He leaned back on the chair and rubbed his nose. "Are you on duty today?" Paul, his senior colleague, asked him sympathetically. "Yeah," answered Samuel. "An hour until the shift. There's no point in going home, so I'll sit here and fill out medical records." "Listen to a more experienced doctor, Samuel." Paul, who was only 33, said with a smile. "Go for a walk, breathe some fresh air, have a coffee, eat properly. Dedicate this hour to yourself, and the medical papers won't go anywhere in that hour." Samuel smiled but decided to follow his colleague's advice. He changed and left the hospital in a good mood. He walked to the nearest coffee shop, took a huge cup of coffee, a double burger, and walked back. He crossed the road and suddenly saw Vanessa in a parked car. In the other second, he realized that in the driver's seat was the head of Vanessa's department, and that they were kissing. So passionately and hotly. Vanessa had never kissed him like that. She was generally against showing feelings in public places. But here, Samuel didn't even remember how he got back to the hospital. The coffee and burger were left untouched. It was good that the duty went smoothly, because he wasn't able to concentrate on work. The next day he submitted his resignation, and in the evening he talked to his wife. He didn't shout, didn't cry, didn't make a scene. He spoke calmly and clearly. "Samuel, it's not what you think," Vanessa shouted. "Vanessa, enough," he said tiredly. "I love you, not him," she said. "I just need to make my way. Do you know how hard it is without the right connections?" "You can do whatever you think is necessary," said Samuel, "just without me." After that, Samuel got a job at a small hospital in a remote town near where he spent his childhood. The management there was simply happy and couldn't believe that a skillful doctor wanted to work for them. There were no applicants for the therapist position there, and there was a lot of work. However, Samuel was quite satisfied with this. He immersed himself in work and wasn't going to return to previous life. And now, Samuel finished his shift and was on his way to his summer cottage. He only stopped by the store again, despite a feeling that there might not be anyone at the cottage. Nevertheless, he decided that provisions wouldn't hurt. However, there were lights on in the windows and smoke coming from the chimney. It had once been a house where Samuel lived with his parents and older brother during their childhood, but that was a long time ago. "I'm here," the man announced as he opened the door. Inside it was warm and clean. The floors were washed, the dust was wiped away, and there was a pleasant smell of food. "Hi," Betty said quietly and smiled shyly. Samuel noticed that she was wearing his old shirt and pants, which were much too big for her and hung loosely. Little Sophie was sitting on the floor by the fireplace, playing with a jar. She was wrapped in a huge towel. "I'm sorry," Betty said shyly, clutching the hem of the shirt. "I washed my clothes." "That's great, and I don't mind you using the clothes," They're all for the cottage anyway." The girl nodded, then gestured towards the table. "Dinner?" Samuel asked. "I'd love to. Just let me wash my hands." He placed the bags on the table and went to the bathroom. When he returned, the bags had been unpacked and plates were set on the table. "It's delicious," Samuel commented after having the meal. "I never thought such a masterpiece could be made from such simple ingredients. You have real talent." Betty smiled faintly. "Thank you." Throughout dinner, Samuel pondered over how to start a conversation. He had a woman and a small child in his house for the second day, and he knew nothing about them except their names. "I've eaten," declared little Sophie, looking at Betty. "Cartoons?" she asked, and the girl nodded in response. Betty picked her up and carried her into the room, where soon the sound of a children's program could be heard. Samuel cleared the table, placed the dishes in the sink and began to wash them. "I would have done that myself," he heard from behind. "I should have thanked you somehow for the wonderful dinner." 2 years ago, I couldn't even make scrambled eggs," she said quietly. Samuel silently looked at the sad girl and waited for her to finally start her story. Betty quickly descended the marble staircase, ignoring her father's shout. "If I hear about your antics one more time, you can forget about—" Whatever she was supposed to forget, she didn't hear. She slammed the door so hard that her mother's crystal collection on the fireplace must have scattered. "Get in!" She heard her friend Gloria's loud, joyful voice from her brand-new red car. "Wow!" Betty said admiringly, fastening her seatbelt. "Who gave this to you?" Gloria shook her short blonde hair. "My father. Who else?" "For what?" "For not telling my mum about his new mistress." Gloria smiled dazzlingly. "You're lucky. I've been trying to convince my mum to get a new car for 2 months now, but she thinks that my Mercedes is fine because they bought it less than a year ago. Well, it seems like I won't be seeing a new car for a long time after yesterday," Betty sighed. Gloria sympathetically asked, "Where are we going now? Let's get something to eat. You can tell me what happened." Half an hour later, Gloria parked outside a fancy restaurant. "Hey, parking is forbidden here," a passing guy shouted at her. Gloria made an obscene gesture and said with an arrogant smile, "VIP clients can do anything they want." Inside the restaurant, they were immediately led to the best table. "So tell me about yesterday," Gloria said as they ordered. Betty sighed. "It's nothing exceptional. I just threw a small party and things got a little out of hand." "A little?" Gloria asked. "True," Betty cut her off. "The neighbours were just too nasty and called the police." When the bill arrived, Betty tried to pay with her card, but the payment failed. After one more failed attempt, Gloria offered to pay with hers. Once the waitress left, she asked sympathetically, "Apparently they blocked your cards." "Don't worry, my parents did it a couple of times, but it didn't last long." "It's the first time. Usually my mother calms my father down and discourages him from such drastic measures," Betty replied resentfully. Gloria laughed. "Everyone has a first time when their parents block their card. I'm sure they'll quickly change their minds, but just in case, take out some cash next time and keep it at home as an inviolable reserve." After visiting the restaurant, the friends headed to Gloria's house. They relaxed, sipped on champagne, and began to discuss the plans for the evening. Gloria suggested they stay in, watch some TV or play video games. However, Betty was adamant about going out. "This day has been long and challenging enough. I need to go out. Let's hit a club we've never been to before." Gloria contacted a few acquaintances and finally, one of them suggested an interesting place. "Where is this place? What's it like? Are you certain?" Gloria questioned her acquaintance about the nightclub, and when she ended the call, she turned to Betty. "Ben recommended that place. It's a bit far, a little grimy and dark, but interesting in its own way." "That's precisely what I need tonight," Betty decisively said. "Let's get ready." The club was in a semi-basement and was not easy to find. "Are you sure we are at the right place?" Betty asked. "This is the address Ben gave me. Look, there's a sign," Gloria responded, pointing towards the entrance. The club's interior was minimalistic, with dim neon lights. Initially, Gloria and Betty felt uncomfortable. Then Gloria recognized a couple of guys, and they joined their table. After a few cocktails, Betty loosened up and laughed at the guys' jokes. She received several calls from her parents, but chose to ignore them. When her attempts to use her blocked card failed, her frustration with her parents intensified. Eventually, she noticed her increasing dizziness and decided to step outside. The chilly evening air offered a refreshing contrast. Taking a few steps away from the club, she chose to take a brief walk. She had no plans to go far, just a lap around the club. She was about 10 meters from the club entrance, and she heard footsteps behind her. Assuming it was Gloria or one of the guys catching up, she turned around, but she didn't have time to react. When she awoke, she found herself in an unfamiliar place. She had experienced memory lapses before, but this time she remembered everything. The argument with her parents, the club, stepping out for some fresh air. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she realized she was lying on a narrow, wiry bed that dug uncomfortably into her body. A thin, musty-smelling blanket was draped over her. Nearby, she could make out an old wooden table and a chair. There were no windows in sight. What had happened? How did she end up here? "Hey!" Betty shouted. "Is anyone here?" She attempted to sit up, but felt dizzy and nauseous, and the back of her head ached. Touching her head, she found something wet and sticky in her hair. Suddenly, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from afar. Moments later, the door swung open, revealing a towering man on the threshold. "Hello," Betty said, her heart prickling with unease. "How did I end up here?" The man appraised her. "Change your clothes," he ordered, tossing something onto the bed. He then shut the door, and Betty heard the lock click. She looked at the old, faded dress he had thrown. It was so worn that even the housekeeper who cleaned her parents' house wouldn't wear it. Firmly, Betty tossed the old dress aside and pounded on the door. A few minutes later, the door clicked open again and the man reappeared. "Why haven't you changed your clothes?" "Who are you? Let me out of here now. Do you know who my father is?" He snorted. "You don't seem to understand anything yet. That's a pity. I thought you were a smart girl." Betty didn't resist for long. She realized that if she wanted to survive, she had to obey. Of course, for the first few days, her mind did not want to accept what had happened to her. It seemed impossible. How could she, a girl from a rich family whose wishes were fulfilled instantly, be here? She couldn't understand how no one had noticed her absence, or why no rescue had come. When the initial shock passed, Betty realized the gravity of the danger she was in. She tried to find out what her kidnapper wanted. Money? If so, her parents would pay any amount. She screamed about it, pounding on the door, but the man didn't care. Betty realized it wasn't money he wanted. After that, she was even more scared. However, he didn't do anything to her at first. The man seemed to enjoy her fear, and the only thing he wanted was for her to obey. And she did. Only after the man realized that the girl was broken did he let her out of the room where he was detaining her. That's when Betty began to realize where she was. She was in a large, old wooden house. The windows were boarded up, allowing little sunlight in, and the lights were always on. There was another person in the house besides her and her captor, a small, dirty, frightened girl, about 3 or 4 years old, dressed in tattered clothes. Betty wanted to ask about the child, but she was afraid of asking too many questions. She stole a glance at the man, trying to discern if the girl resembled him. His facial features seemed blurred, indeterminate. A puffy, rough face was marred by old acne scars. His skin had a strange bluish-yellow hue. He had dark circles under his eyes, a shaggy beard, and dark eyes. At first the man let her leave her room in the basement for an hour, then 2. Then, unexpected, he began leaving her in the house all day. Betty couldn't understand why. She was also confused about many other things. Why was she necessary to him? He mostly kept her in the basement, didn't converse with her, and ignored her questions. If a ransom was involved, she assumed her parents would have paid it by now. "Clean up and cook a meal," he had ordered her the first time he left her alone in the house for the entire day. Naturally, the first thing Betty did was survey her surroundings. But escape was impossible. All the windows were tightly boarded up from the outside, and the heavy door was locked from the outside. The absence of sounds like car noises or human voices led Betty to believe that the house was either in the forest or in an abandoned village. Upon realizing her escape was impossible, Betty began strategizing how to attack the man. The only weapon she found was a short, blunt knife, presumably left for cooking. There were no other sharp or heavy objects in the house. In general, the furnishings were sparse. It seemed the captor must have had other places to live, or he must have been very unpretentious. There was a kitchen with an old stove and an ancient rattling refrigerator, and a room where the man must have slept. There was only a low wooden bed there. "And where do you sleep?" Betty asked the girl, who had been trailing her like a shadow. Although annoyed, Betty felt slightly at ease having someone else around. The girl looked scared but said nothing. "Cool," Betty concluded. "You're also mentally impaired." Finding no useful tools for escape, Betty returned to the kitchen. Was she expected to cook and clean? Betty had never done such tasks. The thought of what could happen if she didn't comply made her shudder. But how could she manage these chores without any experience? Betty tried to recall what the housekeeper did. However, there was no dishwasher, no vacuum cleaner, not even a washing machine. Good thing there was a bathtub, a sink and a toilet. After a brief search, Betty found a broom, a bucket and a rag. She swept up the dust and mopped the floors. All the while, the little girl watched her, gradually inching closer. "Can you talk?" Betty asked the girl, but the child only recoiled, as if she expected to be hit. Betty sighed. "Okay, we'll figure it out. What does he usually feed you?" The girl darted towards the kitchen and something creaked. Following her, Betty saw the little girl pulling a sack of potatoes from a lower cupboard. "Careful there," cautioned Betty. "You might hurt yourself." The child jumped back in fear, causing Betty to instantly regret her harsh tone. "What am I to do with her?" Betty wondered aloud. The girl, seemingly undeterred, retrieved a large saucepan. Apparently it must be boiled, Betty understood. She cut her fingers twice as she peeled the potatoes, slowly, clumsily and awkwardly. Then Betty set the pot on the stove, and the girl handed her a jar. "Oh, salt," Betty noted. "Do I add it now?" The girl nodded. "Well, I suppose I'll have to trust you." Betty smiled sadly, gazing at the silent, pensive Samuel. It felt like a lifetime ago. Over time, she had learned to cook decent meals from a limited array of ingredients, and clean with just a rag and water, so that not a speck of dust remained. All through experience and hardship. The behaviour of her captor was unpredictable. Betty could not discern any pattern to his arrivals and departures. Sometimes he disappeared for half an hour, other times for 2 or 3 days. On his good days, he acted as if Betty and Sophie didn't exist. Betty only learned the girl's name a month ago, when the captor called her for some reason. When he was in a good mood, he would eat, instruct Betty to return to the basement, lock her there, and then go to sleep himself. Once, gathering her courage, Betty asked, "May Sophie come with me?" He simply shrugged, and from then on, Betty and the little girl spent time together in the basement. Initially, Betty hesitated to form a bond with the child, as she hadn't abandoned her hope of escaping, and didn't want to involve a small child in her plan. However, they became very close over time, and Betty conceded one day, "If I escape, I'll take you with me." Several months had passed by then, and Betty's confident when had morphed into an almost hopeless if. She had considered hundreds of escape plans, but hadn't found a feasible one yet. At times, Betty succumbed to despair, envisioning a lifetime spent in the dark old house with boarded-up windows. Sophie was the only thing that saved her. She constantly tried to think of entertaining things for Sophie. She recalled all the fairy tales she had heard from her nanny during her childhood and retold them all. She also recounted the plots of various computer games and movies. Eventually, she began crafting her own stories. Most of these tales involved princesses trapped in castles or dungeons, guarded by fearsome trolls, who were eventually rescued by a brave king or managed to escape. Sophie listened to these stories with rapt attention, her eyes glowing. During these storytelling sessions, Betty herself started to believe in their possible escape. She played hide-and-seek and other games with Sophie, despite the lack of hiding places. They even invented their own games. Over time, Sophie began to speak. Betty realized that Sophie was highly intelligent, her silence stemming likely from fear. Betty didn't want to even think about what the little girl had endured, or how she ended up in their current situation. Any time the topic came up, Sophie would withdraw into herself, and it would take a long time to bring her back out. There were also days when the man was in a bad mood, and it manifested in different ways. Sometimes he would go to his room and start talking to someone, sometimes loudly, sometimes quietly, sometimes pleadingly, almost crying, sometimes shouting and arguing. Betty would try to take Sophie and hide in the basement during these moments. The man usually didn't bother them there, but sometimes he would rampage through the house like a wild animal looking for them. And hearing his approaching footsteps, Betty's heart would pound like mad. She remembers how during one such episode, he roughly grabbed her by the chin and stared intently and for a long time into her face, as if trying to find something in it. It was terrifying to look at him, red, mad eyes, face flushed with blood, hair disheveled. "Not you!" he yelled furiously, pushing Betty away from him. Then he ran out of the basement, and Betty and Sophie listened for several more hours as he argued with someone unintelligibly and tossed furniture around. Such episodes did not happen frequently, once a month, but they were frightening and therefore unpredictable. For example, once he came down to the basement when the girls were already asleep. Betty heard his footsteps and the creaking of the unlocking door. She tensed with fear, but the man was moving carefully, as if he was afraid to scare them, and Betty decided to pretend that she was sleeping. The man came to their bed and suddenly, gently, almost imperceptibly, stroked Betty's head. He was whispering something, but it was impossible to make out a single word. Betty felt as if her wildly beating heart could be heard throughout the room, but she stubbornly pretended to be asleep. The man stood there for a few more minutes, then left, remembering to lock the door. After such episodes, he would become more sluggish and indifferent than usual for several days. One day, Betty decided to try to take advantage of this. At breakfast, she addressed the man. "We need fresh air," she said, "especially the little girl. She might develop rickets. It's dangerous." The man looked at her tiredly but said nothing. After breakfast, he brought 2 coats from somewhere, an adult and a children's. Betty didn't ask. She dressed Sophie and her. The clothes were old but clean. "If any of you make a sound," said the man. His look was more eloquent than words. "We understand," Betty replied. Fear made her throat dry, but she was happy because they would go out into the sun for the first time in several months. The man unlocked the door and gestured for Betty to go ahead. She took Sophie by the hand and went, but at the exit, the man grabbed the little girl's hand and pulled her to him. "He figured out that I've attached myself to her, and I won't run away alone," Betty understood. However, she immediately realized the futility of such an idea. The house was surrounded by a high wooden fence, and the gate was locked. Suppose there was a way to find a suitable place and climb over the fence, even with Sophie in her arms. But where to go next? Betty listened. It was quiet. No cars, no people, no barking dogs, no crowing roosters, no mooing cows. In several places beyond the fence, trees were visible. Betty decided to remember this just in case. "No one lives around here," the man suddenly said. "Just us." Betty looked back. He was watching her so attentively and intently, as if he could read all her thoughts. It made her uncomfortable. "Even if you scream at the top of your lungs, right now no one will hear you. The nearest populated area is 10 kilometers away," the man continued. "Is that so? So he must have a car to get there," Betty thought. "But where is it?" She pretended not to be interested in this. Instead, Betty smiled at Sophie and said in a slightly trembling voice, "Let's gather some beautiful leaves, and at home I'll show you how to make a herbarium." The man hesitated, but let go of the girl's hand, who joyfully gathered a bunch of leaves, apparently from a tree that grew on the other side of the fence. Betty slowly followed her, trying not to betray that she was trying to look around. The plot was small, and it seemed she understood where the car was. There was a small old garage on the plot, and its gates were also locked with a padlock. Then another thought came to Betty. A phone! The man must have one. She never heard him make a call from home. Does he leave it in the car or put it on mute? I need to try to figure this out. And where does he keep all the keys? In his clothes? If he ever forgot to lock the basement door, I could try to get the keys and run away with Sophie. But what would he do to us if he woke up at that moment? Betty was even afraid to think about it. Sophie came up to her, handed a handful of leaves. Betty smiled. "That's enough for today," the man shouted. "Let's go home." Betty felt like a dog that the owner had taken out for a walk to do its business, and now he was calling her back. Clenching her teeth, she gently took Sophie by the hand and led her to the house. Betty stopped her story and pointed to her throat, which was very sore from talking. "I can take a look at your throat," said Samuel. Betty shook her head as if frightened of something. "Okay, I'll go to town tomorrow, get a couple of medicines to make it easier." "Thank you for not asking me to tell everything at once and for your help." Samuel shrugged. "Anybody would have done the same in my place." "Not everyone," Betty said quietly. The Saturday morning bus to the town was almost empty. Except for the doctor, there were a couple of elderly women in it. All the way, Samuel tried to figure out what was happening to him, why he suddenly became a caring nanny for two unknown girls. In the city, the first thing he did was visit his apartment. Of course, everything was covered in dust, flowers wilted, milk in the refrigerator had soured. Samuel packed some of his own things because he decided to live at the cottage for some time. After home, Samuel went to the supermarket, and having bought several bags of things there, he finally went to the cottage. It was nice to see the familiar smoke from the chimney. When Samuel entered the house, little Sophie jumped to him and hugged his legs. "Hello," Samuel said affectionately. "Did you miss me?" The little girl raised her head, looked at him with big serious eyes and nodded. "She was afraid you wouldn't come," said Betty. She stood by the stove and stirred something in a pot. "Sorry for being late," said Samuel. "Had many errands." He put the bags on the table and started unpacking them. "This is for you." He handed one of the bags to Betty. "You can check it in the room with Sophie." Betty looked inside and raised her eyebrows in surprise. "Clothes?" "Yes, I hope I guessed the sizes. Also, there are throat lozenges." Betty took Sophie and led her into the room. When Samuel put all the groceries away, they returned in new outfits. "Thank you," said Betty. "Thank you," Sophie beamed, came up to him and hugged him again. The girls didn't say anything else, so Samuel nodded and asked, "Let's have dinner then." After dinner, Betty washed the dishes, and Samuel stole glances at her, wondering in astonishment. Could her story really be true? She is so skillful and easygoing as she cleans the table and washes dishes, and she doesn't look unhappy or upset. There is nothing about her as a spoiled rich girl. The medicine that Samuel brought helped. Betty was already finding it easier to speak. After a few days, she could talk for longer. Their life somehow quietly settled down. Perhaps it was her psyche that worked this way, not letting too strong emotions out. But Betty seemed to calmly blend into this new life. In the morning she got up early, out of habit, formed over a year, prepared breakfast, even though Samuel told her every day that it was not necessary, that he could take care of himself. But Betty couldn't stop doing it. Maybe it had really become some kind of reflex for her. Breakfast meant safety, absence of punishment, or maybe she just wanted to thank the person who saved them. Then the doctor left for work. Betty cleaned up the table and sat down to read a book. After a couple of hours, Sophie woke up. Betty washed her, fed her, and then they did something together. They read books, watched cartoons, prepared lunch, cleaned the house. In the evening, Samuel returned. Almost every day, he brought them something: food, toys, books. "Don't spend too much," Betty once asked him. "We have everything we need." "Don't worry, I have money. I don't have anyone else to spend it on, and Sophie is happy." That was the truth. The little girl looked at the candy, yogurt, ordinary doll with amazement and delight. Betty understood how all this was wonderful for Sophie. The girl probably saw only pancakes and some kind of cookie in her life. That's all that Betty could come up with, from milk, flour, eggs and sugar. Now Betty herself was happy, looking at ordinary products: sausage, cheese, cereals, apples. And she was surprised, realizing that just over a year ago, she wouldn't have even looked at any of these products. How everything has changed. Then one evening, Betty continued her story. The months passed, and Betty had less and less hope of escaping. Periodically, she would fall into a strange state of desperation and not notice what was happening around her. And only the little girl made her come to her senses. Betty was distracted while playing with her or telling her something, but then fell back into indifference. Why should I live? Why is to fight if there is no hope of escape? And what if no one has been looking for me for a long time? What if my parents decided that it's just another of my antics and I ran away of my own free will? The only entertainment for Betty and Sophie were walks in the fresh air, but the man took them out not every day and at different times. Sometimes he wouldn't let them out of the house for weeks, and sometimes they went out every morning for a whole week, but only for 15 minutes at most. Once, Betty sat and thought about how much their lifestyle was affecting their health. Their diet mainly consisted of potatoes, pasta, cereals from various grains, bread, cabbage. For meat, they had cheap sausages, sometimes cutlets and chicken. Betty saw that her skin had become dry. Her hair was constantly falling out. She looked at her nails and smiled, thinking about what her mother or Gloria would say if they saw her in such a state. But you can't make a beauty out of a piece of soap. But most of all, Betty felt sorry for Sophie. She's just a child. She probably thinks that the world consists of an old dark cage and a few meters of grass to the fence. Her body was just forming. They should have eaten more vegetables, fruit, and been in the sun more often than once every 3 days for 15 minutes. Autumn soon came. It was cold to sleep in the basement, and Betty asked the man for another blanket, but apparently he was not in the right mood and ignored the request. Therefore, every night the girls slept close together to keep warm, and sometimes Betty told Sophie stories. "Far, far from here," Betty began, "there is a magical country. The king of this country had 2 daughters. They were called Princess Rose and Princess Lily." "Were they beautiful?" Sophie interrupted. "Very," said Betty, stroking the girl's head. The sisters loved each other very much and were pleased in the palace. They walked in the beautiful garden, ate sweet, tasty fruits, swung on swings and rode unicorns. But one day, a wicked giant saw the girls. He waited until the king and the royal guards were distracted and stole the girls. And he took them to his cave. There he hid the sisters. "Why did he do this?" Sophie suddenly asked. "I wish I knew myself," thought Betty. Aloud, she said, "The giant wanted the girls to entertain him with their songs and dances. He locked them in a damp dungeon, fed them terribly, and made them work a lot. The giant thought that the princesses would soon forget who they really were and stay with him forever. But the girls remembered their father, the castle, the magic garden, and really wanted to return home. One day, When the giant was asleep, they sneaked up to him and stole the keys. At that moment, Sophie gave a joyful gasp, and Betty's heart clenched. She had told plenty of versions of this fairy tale, but Sophie was delighted every time, as if it were the first. The girls opened the doors and ran out of the cave, Betty continued. The giant woke up, noticed that the captives were gone, and started the chase. He chased the princesses for 3 days and nights. The girls ran across the field, climbed over the mountain, and the giant followed. They went through the dark, gloomy forest, but he did not lag. And when the girls were already exhausted, the royal palace appeared in front of them. The guard saw them, rushed up, and dealt with the giant. Betty looked at Sophie and saw that she was already asleep. She held Sophie tighter and was about to fall asleep herself when her gaze stopped on the radiator. It was rusty and old and hardly heated, but Betty had an idea of how it could be useful to them. A whole month had passed since Betty told Sophie the fairy tale about the sisters, princesses and the giant. It was already freezing outside. They now only went out for a couple of minutes. The man did not provide winter clothes, and it was freezing in the autumn ones. He did eventually give them a second blanket. It got a bit better. But the best thing was that Betty finally had a plan of escape. She had been sitting here for over a year, and all this time she could not think of anything. And here, just one thought popped into her head, and from it, ideas started lining up, one after the other, like a chain. The main thing was that their overseer did not suspect anything ahead of time. So Betty behaved just perfectly. She cleaned meticulously, cooked the best she could think of from the products they had. The bad thing was that now the man did not leave them as often and for a long time as in the summer. But the good thing was that his departures became regular. He was home for 2 days, then he left, returning only in the afternoon or the following day. Probably got a new job, Betty thought. He is unlikely to work somewhere permanently and in a good position, most likely a security guard of some warehouse. Now everything could be planned properly. Betty used every absence of the man to work out her plan. Finally the day came. The man came back tired. The bags under his eyes were even bigger than usual, and his face was pale yellow. "Give me the food," said the man angrily. Betty tried to serve the table as slowly as possible. He even yelled at her a couple of times. Betty flinched but said nothing. When she noticed how Sophie was shaking, she sat next to her and reassuringly squeezed her hand under the table. The little girl calmed down. They also ate slowly. The man had already finished, and Betty had barely managed half a portion. He sighed, but apparently he had no more energy to yell. After Betty washed the dishes, the man got up from the table. The girls obediently headed towards the basement. They went inside. He was about to close the door when suddenly Betty shouted, "Oh, there's water in here!" "What water?" the man said angrily and went inside. The girl was right. The entire floor was covered in water. The bed was flooded. Even the 2 lower steps were submerged. The kidnapper cursed and ran for tools. It took him some more time to shut off the water. Then he found boots, went down and checked the radiator. "How did it manage to burst? What an old rusty piece of junk." He turned to Betty. "Bring a bucket, we need to scoop out the water." Betty obediently went and began to carry water. It was clear that there was a lot of work here until morning. "Okay, you'll finish it tomorrow during the day," said the man after half an hour. "Maybe it will drain itself overnight. You can sleep in the house tonight." Betty nodded without raising her eyes, so that the man would not understand that she had been aiming for this. It was difficult to break the radiator. Fortunately, it was indeed old and rusted, and after a long search, Betty found a weak spot. The blanket and pillow had not had time to get wet. Betty took them and laid them on a small mattress, which Sophie had been sleeping on before. There was little space, the mattress was thin, but comfort was of little concern to Betty today. She turned around, hugged Sophie to herself. "Sleep," said Betty. The girl buried her face in her side and obediently closed her eyes. Betty was sure that the man would be checking if they were asleep. So it happened. After half an hour, he looked into the room. Betty breathed calmly and evenly, like Sophie, although she was sure that the little one was also not sleeping. The man went back to his room. For some more time it was audible, as he was muttering something, walking from corner to corner. Then the squeak of the bed was heard and everything fell silent. Just to be certain, Betty waited another hour, carefully got up. Sophie immediately opened her eyes and looked at her. Betty put her finger to her lips. The girl nodded. "What a smart girl you are," thought Betty. She carefully left the room. Good that a light bulb was on in the corridor, very dim but enough for her. First of all, Betty took their clothes with Sophie. If something doesn't go according to plan and they have to run away without warm clothes, it will have sorrowful consequences for them in December. Betty dressed first, then took care of Sophie. The girl was silent. "Aren't you afraid?" Betty quietly asked her. "I'm not afraid of anything with you," answered the girl. Betty nodded, feeling how tears almost welled up in her eyes. "I have to make it. I simply cannot let Sophie down." She left the girl at the front door and quietly slipped into the man's room. The light from the hallway bulb barely penetrated here. Betty was navigating more from her memory. She had found out that he kept the keys in his jacket pocket. The jacket was hung on a nail above his bed. Betty froze and listened. The man's breathing was quiet and steady. She carefully leaned over him and reached out to the jacket. She covered the pockets with her palms and began to feel through it. There was something heavy in the right pocket. Slowly, trying to keep the keys from jingling, Betty pulled out the heavy keychain. She left the room. Sophie was still standing near the door. Betty began to examine the keychain. In the dim light of the bulb, she remembered that the key the man used to lock the door was yellow. There was only one like it. The door opened almost noiselessly. Betty let Sophie out, then slipped out herself and closed the door. It was probably not that late, but they always went to bed early, especially in winter. The moon was already shining through the clouds. Well, that's a good sign, thought Betty. She ran to the gate. It took longer to find the right key here. Betty swung the gates open and rushed to the garage. It seemed she had to fiddle with the third lock the longest. Finally, the garage was also open. "There we go," said Betty. She grabbed Sophie, put her in the front seat and buckled her up. She was about to get in behind the girl when someone grabbed her by the hair and yanked her back. Betty screamed. "Vile wretch!" the man yelled. "Do you want to run away from me again?" "Again?" Betty thought in surprise. The man was dragging her back, tightly gripping her throat with his fingers. Betty fought back as best she could, but their strength was not comparable. She could hear Sophie crying in the car and realized with horror that if she didn't do something now, they wouldn't get a second chance. The man dragged her into the house and pushed her towards the basement. "You're sleeping there tonight," he yelled. "If you freeze and catch pneumonia, that's your problem." The man loosened his grip for just a second, but it was enough for Betty. With all her might, she hit him over the head with a tool, not even realizing where she got the strength. The man slumped to the floor, and a trickle of blood ran down his forehead. He didn't pass out, and Betty realized that she only had a few seconds. She ran out of the house and slammed the door. With trembling hands, she pulled the keys out of her coat pocket and locked the door from the outside. It occurred to her that he might have hidden a spare set of keys in the house for such occasions, but she still bought a little more time. She ran to the garage, jumped into the front seat, and hugged the sobbing Sophie. "Shh, my sunshine," she croaked, only now realizing how tightly the man had been squeezing her throat. Betty had no more strength to speak, and she focused on the car. She managed to start it and drove out of the garage. She hadn't driven for over a year, but now her hands seemed to remember what to do on their own. Beyond the gates, she finally saw other houses. It seemed the man hadn't lied to them. There were no lights anywhere, making the village seem dead. There was only one road leading out of the village, and that's the way they drove. Betty was afraid to drive fast, but she wanted to get away from there as soon as possible. The road was dirt, completely covered with snow, and the car kept bouncing on invisible bumps. The snowstorm was getting stronger, and Betty was afraid that she could crash or run off the road. "Well, no," she said aloud, addressing either Sophie or herself. "We're not going to die that stupidly." The road was absolutely empty, not a single car or sign. At some point, they drove onto a highway. There, the occasional lights of other cars started to flicker. Betty breathed a sigh of relief. "We've escaped! Now we need to try to get to the city, but which one?" She didn't know where or how far from the club she was taken. Maybe she was thousands of kilometers away from home. All of a sudden, something under the hood went haywire, and the car stopped. Betty tried several times to start it, to no avail. Annoyingly, no one was driving on the highway at that moment. Where did they all go when we needed them so badly? Where did they all go when we needed them so badly? Betty sighed. She got out and looked around. In the distance behind, the forest, lights were visible. It seemed like there was some settlement. There were no other options. Betty pulled Sophie out of the car, picked her up and went straight through the forest. She herself didn't know how long they walked. At first it was cold, and then their hands and feet stopped feeling. Several times the girl wanted to give up. She imagined how she would lie down in this soft, warm, fluffy snow and be covered with its white down comforter. But she stubbornly moved her legs and didn't even notice at what point they came out of the forest onto the street. And then a car stopped near them. And you already know the rest. Betty finished with a sad smile. Samuel looked at her with a mixture of horror and admiration. "Poor girls," he finally said. "What you've been through." He couldn't say anything for a long time, imagining himself in their place. Probably he would have given up long ago, if he was locked in a basement, or if he was caught during the escape, or if he was trudging through the forest. But they didn't. "Betty," Samuel said, "why haven't you asked me to contact your parents yet? They don't know you're alive." The girl smiled sadly. "It's not that simple, Samuel. I'm not sure if they want to see me." "What are you talking about? They're your parents." She sadly looked at him with her big black eyes. "We had a difficult relationship. I understand it's hard for you to believe this now, but I grew up in a very wealthy family. I was the only child, who was spoiled, who didn't know the word no. I did everything I wanted, even in elementary school. I could swear at the teachers, do nasty things to classmates. I stole my dad's car at 13, crashed it. He paid a large sum to hush up the case. At 14, I started drinking and smoking. At 15, going to clubs and dating boys. Of course, Mum and Dad tried to forbid it. We often quarrelled. Sometimes they locked me in the room, took away the phone, but eventually everything was as I wanted. I somehow graduated from school. My dad just paid the principal. Then the money helped me get into university. I got an apartment and a car. Do you think I became more mature? Smarter? No, everything only got worse. I went to study when there was nothing else to do. Otherwise, I spent my dad's money, threw parties and raced in cars. Several times I was detained by the police. My father bailed me out. During one of my parties, my apartment was literally smashed, and the neighbours again called the police. Here, the patience of my parents ended. We had a serious quarrel. My father said that he would leave me without money, because only then would I have a chance to grow up and become a person. I replied something about that I did not ask them to give birth to me, and since they did, let them now reconcile with what they raised. My father said in response that he and Mum thought long ago about terminating the pregnancy, and it seems made the wrong decision. Then I shouted that I hoped for his death in a car accident as soon as possible, because I would like to be a rich heiress. After these words, my father shouted that I was no longer the daughter to him. Betty fell silent, snuffled. Samuel handed her a pack of tissues. She nodded gratefully, wiped her eyes, blew her nose, and continued. Yes, the last thing I said to my parents was that I wished them death, and I really deserved that they didn't consider me as their daughter. So I don't know if I'm ready to contact them. Betty hesitated, then added, I'm sure you know my parents, at least my father for sure. She walked to the bookcase and reached inside. Samuel suddenly remembered how on the first day he saw through the window that Betty was hiding something there. The girl handed him some old newspaper. I found it when I was looking for something to heat the stove, she explained. The first page had an article about the disappearance of the daughter of a famous businessman. Seeing the last name, Samuel whistled. So that's who your father is? Betty bitterly smiled. Yeah, I don't really look like the daughter of such a person right now. Samuel sighed. I also had not simple relationships with my father. Mum left us when my brother was 12 and I was 9. We lived in this house back then. It seemed that everything was fine, and then she suddenly leaves a note to her father that she can't do it anymore and leaves for another country. Probably he has hated all women since then. He didn't abandon us, raised us, but for some reason always loved only the older brother. Maybe because Mum loved me, I don't know. John was always his good boy. He went to law school, and I to medical. He opened his own business, and I am just a doctor in a clinic. Furthermore, he has 2 children, and I divorced. I tried so many years to live up to his expectations. I thought, a little more and Dad will understand, appreciate what a good, smart, wonderful son I am. Betty carefully placed her palm on Samuel's forearm and stroked it. He nodded gratefully. We rarely talk to him and hardly see each other, but I have a great relationship with my brother and his family. I don't know what to advise you about parents. Probably only that you can try to reach them out. At least you will not suffer from uncertainty and put an end to it. I'll think about it, and since we have a night of revelations, can I ask you something personal? Samuel smiled. Of course, ask. Why are you fussing with us? Don't think I'm not truly grateful to you. It's just fate that we met you with Sophie, but we are completely strangers to you. You could just let us warm up and spend the night, and that would be more than enough. But you drive us away. You feed us, buy clothes and toys. Samuel just shrugged his shoulders. What can I say? Probably it is just my essence. Helping others has always been in my blood, so I became a doctor. This is what I cannot change in myself. Thank you. You are an excellent person. I wanted to ask something else, Samuel said thoughtfully. Why don't you go to the police? Betty sighed, hesitated a little, but answered, Because of Sophie. I don't know who she is and where she came from. My worst assumption is that she is the kidnapper's daughter. She didn't tell you this? She either doesn't remember or doesn't want to talk. I'm afraid they'll take her away from me, send her to an orphanage. How will she be there without me? Besides, I don't know where the kidnapper is now. Do you think he could get out of the house? For sure. He could hide another set of keys at home. He could break the lock, break the window and tear off the boards. Could call on the phone and call for help. I don't even know if he had a phone. Are you afraid that he will find you? Betty nodded. The car abandoned on the highway must have been found long ago. Then he knows where it was left and can guess where to look for us. Maybe someone picked you up on the road and took you to the city, or you've already gone to the police. How can he know for sure? There are many options. I'm sure he won't poke around here. In any case, you can live with me for as long as you want. And I, if you don't mind, will consult my brother. He is a lawyer. The girl nodded, and the next day Samuel visited his brother. John, I need your help. Tell me, what happened to you? That's the point, it's not about me. Samuel was talking for a long time. John listened with increasing surprise, did not interrupt, only occasionally asked clarifying questions. Well, you have really heated things up, he said admiringly when Samuel finished the story. So we think he's a quiet one, sits in the remote hospital, works as a rural doctor. And he's here saving girls. Samuel sighed. I'm not saving anyone, just trying to help, so let's get to the point. John immediately straightened up, became collected and serious. Of course, I will bring the right people, but I think everything can be arranged. He will put Betty and the girl in some rehabilitation centre. They will not need to be separated there. Or do you want them to live with you? Yes. Interesting. Okay, we'll think of something. As for the kidnapper, it's a pity, of course. She didn't go to the police immediately. I think they would have caught him right away. But now it's like looking for a needle in a haystack. And I have a better idea. Let's go to your place. I'll meet your girls in person and we'll talk and decide how to proceed. Betty decided to bake a pie, found a huge jar of apricot jam in the fridge, and thought it would be good to use it. She was in a great mood. Sophie was watching some cartoon in the room. I'm making a pie, Betty told her. Do you want to join me? The girl shook her head negatively, not taking her eyes off the screen. Betty smiled and closed the door. Before, Sophie wouldn't have left her inside, but now she was no longer afraid to stay alone in the room. Betty returned to the kitchen and began to knead the dough. She was waiting for Samuel to return and preparing to call her parents and, of course, to report to the police. Now she was ready to survive a meeting with her father and mother. Even if they said they didn't want to see her any more, let it be. But the thought of parting with Sophie, the mere thought of the girl being taken away from her, made Betty feel bad. But she understood that it was inevitable. After all, they couldn't live forever in the cottage at Samuel's expense. No matter how kind he was, there is a limit to everything. The front door behind creaked. Betty smiled and wanted to say something, but suddenly she was grabbed by the neck. You thought I wouldn't find you, a familiar voice said. Betty went cold. You thought you could run away from me, the kidnapper continued. Didn't work then, won't work now. He dragged her to the door. Betty hardly resisted. The main thing is that Sophie didn't hear anything. He didn't remember about her. Maybe there's a chance he'll only take me. Samuel should be back soon. He will understand, guess what happened to me and call the police. There's a chance they'll find us by following the hot trail. The main thing is that Sophie doesn't have to go through this again. The man was dragging Betty across the yard, seemingly towards a car. He was mumbling something, but the words were indistinguishable. He tightened his grip on her throat so much that she started seeing colourful spots before her eyes. Her legs began to tangle, and she barely realised that she was being shoved into the back seat of a car. The last thing she heard was the desperate screech of brakes. When Betty came to, even before opening her eyes, she remembered what had happened. She prepared herself to see the familiar ceiling of a damp basement. Suddenly, the most dear child's voice in the world rang out next to her. Betty! Sophie is here too, so he took her as well. Betty opened her eyes and was surprised to see that she was in the same bedroom where she had been sleeping the last few days. Beside her stood Sophie and Samuel. Finally! The man sighed in relief and took her wrist. He paused for a few seconds. Pulse is normal. How do you feel? Betty shrugged. I'm well, just my throat hurts again. That's fixable. The main thing is that we made it in time. Betty tried to smile. At that moment another man entered. He looked very much like Samuel, only he looked a bit older and was broader in the shoulders. Ah, our brave princess has woken up, he said joyfully. I told you everything would be fine. The last sentence was directed at Sophie, who was smiling happily. What happened? Where is he? Asked Betty and sat up sharply on the bed. We made it in time, Samuel answered. He's immobilized and waiting for the police. So, you can breathe freely. The worst is definitely over. A year later. Betty had just set the last plate on the table when the front door opened and Samuel's elder brother's whole family bustled in. Merry Christmas, John immediately shouted with a smile. Where's my little niece? Why isn't she meeting me?" "I'm here," came from somewhere deep inside the house, and a happy Sophie entered a second later. In one leap she flew into John's arms, and he even grunted from the surprise, but managed to hold the girl. After everyone hugged and said hello, the children ran upstairs, and the adults went for coffee. "So, any news?" John asked. "It's been a long time since we last saw you." "Betty has finished processing the adoption papers for Sophie," said Samuel. "Oh, finally! We need to celebrate this immediately," John said, and in the next second he opened a bottle of champagne, popping the cork into the ceiling. The women shrieked. Lucille gave her husband a playful slap, but immediately held out the glasses. John deftly filled them. "I also went with Sophie to see my parents," Betty said a bit quieter. "How did it go?" Lucille asked seriously. "Surprisingly well," Betty answered. "Sometimes it seems to me that they still haven't gotten used to the fact that I came back and changed so much. Sometimes they look at me and it's unclear if they're sure I'm their daughter." "It's very good that you made up," John said. "It's all thanks to Samuel," Betty said and looked tenderly at her fiancé. "He persuaded me." Samuel blushed slightly and shrugged. In any case, it was worth trying. Sophie should have grandparents. "And what about him?" Lucille asked. Betty smiled maliciously. "We were promised that he will never be free." "Oh, well, we definitely need to drink to that, and then to move on to some lighter topic," John said. "Well then, I want to say a toast," said Samuel and turned to Betty. "I could say that the last few years have been difficult for me, but knowing what you've been through, I can't say that. Yes, they certainly weren't happy. I felt like I was existing on autopilot, until one moment I met you and Sophie. From that very moment I came alive. I don't know whether it was fate that brought us together, or something else. All I can say is, right now, I'm happy, and I want to be with you always." Betty wiped away a tear and raised her glass. She would have liked to say something, but because of the excitement and the joy that overwhelmed her, she couldn't. "Oh, guys," John said, "even me, an old man, you brought to tears. What can I say? Merry Christmas, and happy years together."